Your brain remembers one bad review longer than it remembers 10 good ones, and that has almost nothing to do with your mood that day. That's negativity bias. It's not moodiness, and it's not a character flaw you need to apologize for. It's wiring laid down long before performance reviews or customer feedback forms existed. Psychologists estimate negative events carry roughly 5 times the emotional weight of positive ones in how they get processed and stored. 5 times. That's not a small tilt in the scale. That's the scale being fundamentally lopsided from the start, for every person doing the weighing. It helps to be precise about what this bias is not, because it's easy to confuse it with simple pessimism or a bad mood, and the two are not the same thing at all. A pessimist expects bad outcomes across the board, evenly, as a general disposition. Negativity bias is narrower and stranger than that. It doesn't make bad things more likely to happen. It makes bad things, once they happen, weigh more heavily in memory and judgment than good things of equal or even greater size. A genuinely optimistic manager, someone who expects the best from their team by default, is just as subject to this asymmetry as a pessimistic one, because the bias operates on how information gets weighted after the fact, not on what someone expects going in. That's part of why it's so easy to miss in yourself specifically. You can feel entirely fair-minded, entirely warm toward your team, and still be running a mental ledger that quietly counts one bad week as worth 5 good ones. One study asked couples to rate the health of their relationships over time, tracking specific positive and negative interactions as they happened. The finding was almost mathematically precise. It took roughly 5 positive interactions to offset the emotional damage of a single negative one. Not 2, not 3, for a rough balance. 5, just to get back to even. That ratio wasn't a coincidence specific to romantic relationships either. Similar imbalances show up wherever researchers have looked for them, because the mechanism underneath isn't about romance at all. It's about how threat-relevant information gets prioritized by a brain that evolved to survive, not to be fair. It's worth being clear about what makes this bias so hard to simply decide your way out of. Knowing about it intellectually doesn't neutralize it. In the same way, knowing an optical illusion is an illusion doesn't stop your eyes from seeing it. A manager who has read every study on negativity bias will still feel the sting of one sharp piece of feedback more intensely than the warmth of 9 pieces of praise. In the moment, physically, before any conscious reasoning gets a chance to intervene. The bias operates upstream of deliberate thought, in the same fast, automatic system that flags a loud noise or a sudden movement as worth paying attention to before you've consciously decided anything is happening at all. That's exactly why the fix has to be structural rather than willpower-based. You cannot outthink a reflex. You can only build habits and documentation that compensate for it after the fact. The exact same math shows up at work, quietly, in rooms that have nothing to do with anyone's marriage. A manager praises someone 9 separate times across a quarter, specifically, sincerely, in front of other people even, then criticizes them once, in a single one-on-one, about a single missed detail. Ask that employee at the end of the quarter what stands out from the last 3 months, and overwhelmingly, they'll reach for the criticism first. Not because the praise didn't register, it registered. It just didn't stick the way the criticism stuck, because sticking isn't about sincerity or volume. It's about how the brain files threat-adjacent information differently from everything else. This isn't a flaw you can coach someone out of with a pep talk or a gratitude journal. It's how human attention evolved over an extremely long stretch of time, under conditions that had nothing to do with quarterly reviews. Missing a threat once, a predator, a bad water source, a hostile stranger, could get you killed, immediately, permanently, with no second chance to learn from the mistake. Missing a compliment never did that. There was never any evolutionary pressure pushing a brain to weight praise as heavily as danger, because praise was never the thing standing between a person and an early death. So brains got very good, very fast, at prioritizing the spotting of danger over the registering of good news, and that wiring didn't update itself just because most modern threats are now things like a terse email instead of a predator in the grass. In performance reviews specifically, this backfires constantly, in a very predictable and almost mechanical way. A single harsh line embedded in an otherwise genuinely glowing review will dominate how that person feels for weeks afterward. sometimes longer. They'll read the positive paragraphs once, nod, and move on. They'll read the one critical sentence 5 times, turning it over, wondering exactly what it meant, whether it's a sign of something bigger, whether the manager secretly thinks less of them than the rest of the document suggests. Layoff announcements, similarly, get remembered word for word, sometimes for years, by people who weren't even affected by them. Praise delivered in the exact same all-hands meeting from the exact same leader fades from memory by lunchtime. Even the order feedback gets delivered in changes how the whole thing lands, which is a strange and slightly unfair wrinkle on top of an already unfair baseline. Leading with criticism colors everything that follows it, even genuine, specific praise that comes right after. Once the negative frame is installed first, positive information afterward gets processed as damage control, as softening, rather than as an independent, equally true observation about the person's work. Structuring feedback backward, starting with the hard part, isn't a neutral choice about pacing. It changes the emotional outcome of the entire conversation before the second sentence even starts. Sales teams see a version of this too, and it's worth pausing on because it shows the bias operating on aggregate morale, not just on one person's memory of one review. One angry, detailed customer complaint can outweigh 50 quiet 5-star ratings sitting in the same dashboard. The 50 satisfied customers didn't write paragraphs. They didn't need to. Satisfaction is quiet by nature. Anger is loud, specific, and memorable. And a sales floor that reads that one complaint allowed in a Monday meeting will feel its morale shift measurably more than 50 unread 5-star ratings could ever lift it back up. Healthcare settings show a stark version of this asymmetry that most people outside the field never think about. A single adverse outcome, even a rare, statistically unavoidable one, can dominate how a clinician's competence gets judged for years, discussed in case reviews long after hundreds of successful, unremarkable outcomes for other patients have simply been absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of the job and forgotten. Nobody holds a meeting to discuss the routine recovery. Everyone remembers the complication, sometimes long after the actual clinical decision-making has been reviewed and cleared. The same asymmetry, the same 5-to-1 style weighting, just showing up in a setting with much higher stakes than a quarterly review. Educators run into an almost identical pattern, grading essays across a stack of 40 papers in one sitting. A single jarring grammatical error or an oddly phrased sentence early in an otherwise strong essay can anchor a grader's impression downward for the rest of the read, even when the remaining pages are genuinely excellent. Graders who are aware of this sometimes deliberately read essays twice, once for an overall impression and once specifically hunting for strengths they might have glossed past the first time, precisely because they know the first read will have overweighted whatever went wrong early and underweighted everything that went right afterward. None of this means the answer is to stop giving honest, direct feedback, ever, out of fear that the negative parts will land too hard. That's not a fix. That's just avoidance. Wearing a management theory as a disguise and avoiding real problems doesn't make negativity bias go away. It just delays the moment the criticism finally does land, usually with more weight than it would have carried earlier. The actual answer is to calibrate deliberately for an imbalance you now know exists, rather than pretending the scale is neutral when it clearly isn't. If you need someone to hear 5 specific compliments, as clearly and as durably as they'll hear one critique, you cannot just say those 5 things once and move on, trusting they'll land with equal force. They won't, structurally, no matter how sincerely you meant them. You have to repeat them. Write them down somewhere the person can return to later, on a bad day, when the one critical sentence is the only thing echoing in their head. Make the praise concrete enough that it can compete on the same footing as the criticism, because vague praise evaporates almost instantly, while vague criticism, oddly, still tends to stick around. Great job this quarter disappears by the next morning. The client specifically called out how you handled the escalation on the Meridian account. Unprompted, in their renewal call, sticks, because it's specific, sourced, and concrete in exactly the way criticism naturally already is. There's a related asymmetry worth naming, because it explains why this bias survives even in organizations that genuinely try to be fair. Positive feedback tends to arrive in general, summarizing language, because sincerity often reaches for broad, warm phrasing without thinking too hard about precision. "You've been doing great work" is a completely genuine thing to say and completely forgettable to hear. Negative feedback, by contrast, almost has to arrive specific because vague criticism feels unfair even to the person delivering it. So managers instinctively reach for a concrete example when something goes wrong. That asymmetry in specificity compounds the asymmetry in emotional weight. The praise is warm but vague, the criticism is uncomfortable but precise, and precise information beats vague information in memory almost every time, on top of negativity bias, already tilting the scale in the same direction. Two separate mechanisms are quietly pulling in the exact same direction, which is part of why this pattern feels so stubborn even to people who are actively trying to counteract it. Customer-facing teams live inside a particularly visible version of this every single day. A support agent can handle 99 interactions well, generating nothing but quiet, satisfied customers who never think about the interaction again once it's resolved. The 100th interaction, the one that goes sideways, generates a detailed complaint, forwarded up the chain, discussed in a team meeting, sometimes escalated all the way to leadership. That one interaction can end up shaping a performance conversation far more than the 99 successful ones combined. Not because anyone did the math and decided it should, but because the complaint arrived as a specific, documented, threat-shaped artifact, while the 99 successes arrived as nothing at all, which is exactly what success usually sounds like from the outside. This shows up outside the review cycle too, in ways that rarely get tracked but shape morale just as heavily. A support team that resolves 1,000 tickets cleanly in a month will barely mention it in a retro. The one ticket that escalated badly, the one customer who went public with a complaint, gets replayed in the team channel for days, dissected from every angle, referenced again weeks later as a cautionary tale. The 1,000 quiet successes don't generate a story. The one failure does, because stories, like memory itself, are built out of exactly the kind of vivid, threat-shaped material negativity bias is tuned to prioritize. A team's sense of how it's doing overall can end up almost entirely disconnected from its actual numbers, dragged downward by a handful of loud, memorable incidents that statistically represent almost nothing about the team's real performance. Product teams run into a related version of this when reading user feedback. A feature can land well with the overwhelming majority of users, generating quiet, satisfied silence, which is exactly what satisfaction usually sounds like. The handful of users who hated the change will write long, detailed, specific complaints, because frustration motivates people to write in a way contentment simply doesn't. Read only the feedback that arrives unprompted, and a genuinely successful launch can look like a controversial failure, purely because of who bothers to speak up and how vividly they do it. Weighing feedback by volume of words written, rather than by actual proportion of users affected, is negativity bias operating at the level of an entire product roadmap, not just one person's performance review. Managers who understand this tend to build small counterweights into their own habits rather than trying to will the bias away through sheer awareness. Some keep a running document of specific wins, updated in the moment they happen, precisely because relying on memory to reconstruct a balanced picture later always tilts toward whatever went wrong most recently and most vividly. Others deliberately separate the delivery of praise from the delivery of criticism into different conversations entirely, on different days, so the praise gets a real, undiluted moment to land instead of being read as a preamble to the bad news everyone senses is coming next. Here's the part worth sitting with as a manager, honestly, past the mechanics of it. If criticism and praise are never going to land with equal natural weight, then treating them as equal in how much effort you put into delivering each one is itself a quiet failure to communicate accurately. Saying something true once isn't the same as making sure it's actually heard. The takeaway isn't to soften what's true. It's to stop counting feedback by instances and start weighing it by actual impact. One clear, specific correction, paired with real, specific, repeated recognition, lands better and more accurately than either one delivered alone, and it's closer to the truth of most people's actual performance than either extreme on its own. One more practical wrinkle worth naming. Negativity bias doesn't just distort how a manager judges an employee, it distorts how the employee judges themselves. Someone who receives 9 pieces of praise and 1 correction will often walk away from the conversation feeling like the correction was the real message, and the praise was just cushioning around it, softening them up before the actual verdict. That self-assessment then shapes how much risk they're willing to take on the next project, how freely they'll speak up in the next meeting, sometimes for months. Managers who understand the asymmetry sometimes address it directly, out loud, naming the ratio explicitly. Saying something like, "I want to be clear, the specific thing I'm flagging here doesn't erase the pattern I described a minute ago," sounds almost unnecessary to say, and it is precisely the kind of unnecessary-sounding sentence that negativity bias makes necessary anyway. If you've caught yourself remembering one bad meeting from months ago more clearly than an entire good quarter, drop it in the comments, because that gap between what actually happened and what your memory kept is exactly the kind of blind spot worth naming out loud before it quietly shapes your next review.